More now on this major regional trade deal, but one nation that's not going to sign on, it seems, is India. Let's get some analysis with Natasha, Bhaskar, the General Manager at Newland Global Group, specialising in Australia's relationship with India. Why did India get cold feet, Natasha, do you think?
India did not get a cold feet at all, and it is important to understand that when we look at trade agreements are about trade complementarities, and different countries are at different levels of development. And looking at it from the Indian perspective, we have signed free trade agreements with many of these RCEP nations since 2006. And if you look at these numbers, out of the 15 RCEP partners, India has a trade deficit with 13 countries, and which has actually gone up consistently. So in 2004, it was a trade deficit of $7 billion. It went up to $78 billion in 2014, and currently it is at $105 billion in 2019. And out of this, $60 billion of trade deficit is just with China. So we are looking at a sector, in areas where it is very difficult for India. And if you look back, if you really try and understand what led to this pullout, all the countries are driven by their own economic and domestic interests. We are looking at sectors like the agriculture, the dairy sector, the steel sector, the automobile sector, the textile sector, which employs a large number of Indian population. Now, 60% of the country's population is dependent on agriculture. That's a huge number, and that's why I said that we have to look at countries which are at different levels of development. India is not an export-led economy. It wants to be an export-led economy. We are focusing on the manufacturing sector. The Indian Prime Minister has set a target of the Make in India, the manufacturing sector initiative, to increase it by 25% in the next 5 to 6 years. But that's something which is actually a goal which is very, very far-fetched. It is a consumption-led economy. That's where the challenge is, and the sort of concerns, the outstanding concerns, the unresolved issues which were raised in the RCEP negotiations, which have been there for the last 7 years. So when one says that if India actually developed a cold feet, not really, because these are legitimate arguments, these are legitimate concerns, and India would want to go ahead with RCEP even in future. The door is left open, as the Australian Prime Minister said on the RCEP negotiation. But it remains to be, one needs to understand that, are we actually looking at countries to compromise on populations which are hugely dependent on different sectors? Yeah. And that's something which can't really be done.
The reason why the term cold feet's been used, because it basically means, apprehension on a previously planned course of action. And most of the governments, including ours, thought that India were on board. Now they're not. That's the reason for that description. India had seemed to be heading in that direction.
Yes, India was on board since day one, reason being that we went ahead with all the negotiations. There have been a series of talks within the country as well. The Commerce Ministry had set different committees to understand and analyze what exactly went into the, what exactly are the possibilities for India to go ahead with the negotiations. Now, if you look at many of the issues which were raised by the Indian side, one, of course, is the huge trade deficit with China. So the issue was raised that, can we go ahead with an auto trigger mechanism? What that means is that whenever the imports actually go up from any specific country, in this case in China, can India play a safeguard measure, a protective measure to stop this sort of import surge? The second was about data localization. Now, there will be a lot of data exchange when these sort of trade deals happen. Can India protect this data? The third component is about import duties, the tariff barriers, the base year. Now, the base year, what is being discussed right now is 2013. What India wanted was 2019, because the rates are different and it is going to impact the economy. So one has to have if one tries to have a very, very objective viewpoint of what the countries want and what India cannot give, is that it has there has to be an understanding between what exactly is the trade policy and what is our industrial policy. And there is a gap in between. The products which are being made in India right now are not globally competitive, and that's where the challenge for the government is, to how it encourages an industrial policy which is more globally competitive. One component is that the consumers are looking at cheap products coming in from all the countries, but it's also important to protect the interests of the domestic producers, and that's exactly which has been missing in the whole discourse, and which is also an opportunity for Australia to explore bilaterally with India.
Do you think it's more likely that Australia will have the opportunity for a bilateral agreement with India on the side, or do you think that India is going to to be more likely to be looking at this RCEP agreement just further down the track?
Well, from my perspective, I think this is a huge opportunity for Australia to explore a bilateral arrangement with India, especially our free trade agreement with India hasn't really, come along in the last few years, and there are several reasons for that. Also, what India is seeking at this stage is a balance in goods, services, and investment. So there has to be a balance between all the three components. The RCEP negotiations can't just be driven by goods and cutting the tariff barriers on the goods component. It has to also look at the advantages. Now, India has a comparative advantage on services sector. India wants investments, foreign direct investments in the manufacturing sector. What it is getting right now is just in the services sector. So there has to be a balance between the two. For Australian arrangement, and that's what, even from our work perspective, we're trying to create at the Newland Global Group also an understanding that how people understand the Australia-India narrative, which is at this moment, again, is missing. It's largely based on anecdotal assumptions and prejudiced generalizations about the relationship also. India and Australia are natural and strategic partners, but this relationship has to go beyond a buyer-seller relationship to a relationship of being an enabler. Can Australia really be on India's side when it comes to creating a new India, achieving those development goals? And that's where, there's a huge Australian opportunity when Prime Minister Morrison visits India in January 2020 to take these objectives and goals. Let's not forget, we already have an India economic strategy which was released last year by Peter Varghese, and we are now looking at a counter-reciprocal strategy from the Indian side, which is likely to come out in December this year. So the goals are very, very clearly stated. It's just that how do you actually, create a mechanism where both the countries, the comparative advantages of Australia are supported by the priorities which are important for India at this stage.